Hi, my name is Ron Parker, and I am author of the book Chasing Centuries, which tells the story of some interesting agaves that I've found across the desert southwest. And these agaves appear to be anthropogenic cultivars rather than naturally occurring species. And so I've developed a little presentation based upon the book, which first examines the cultures with which we associate these agaves, then takes a look at the reasons that they may have developed and farmed them, before taking a close look at the agaves themselves and ultimately considering their fate. So we have three agrarian pre-Columbian Native American cultures with which we associate these agaves, and these include the Hohokam, the Salado, and the Sonaga. And these folks were in Arizona from roughly AD 200 through AD 1450. That is a long time, and they evolved substantially across that time, and you could bet your bottom dollar they learned how to take advantage of everything the desert had to offer. And some of these folks actually wound up developing some very serious farming skills. So let's take a look at the Hohokam first. They were in central Arizona from roughly AD 450 through 1450. They had an expansive territory of some 30,000 square miles with an epicenter in Phoenix, but their range extended north through the New River Mountains and south and southeast through the Tucson Basin and beyond. These folks had a Mesoamerican connection. We know that by virtue of architectural styles and artifacts found at the site, and they seem to have an even more direct connection with some indigenous tribes along Mexico's western coast. So the Hohokam were accomplished desert farmers with a litany of tools at their disposal, the most impressive of which may have been the development and maintenance of a substantial canal system. They dug canals for miles and miles and wound up irrigating some 70,000 acres of the desert, allowing them to grow squash and corn and cotton and beans and, of course, agave. So this canal system would have been just an unbelievable undertaking in terms of time and labor, and the maintenance of the canal system would have just been never-ending, as you might imagine. And it likely created a framework for their entire social and economic culture. So there was a very interesting archaeological study done in the early 1980s by the Fishes in a little town called Marana, or I should say near a little town called Marana, just west of the Tortolina Mountains, north of Tucson. And these folks noticed some unnatural rock alignments in the area and ultimately concluded that they had come across a 1,200-acre rock mulch farm. Now, rock mulch is a really interesting concept that desert gardeners could still put to very good use today. The idea is to build rock piles. They would average perhaps a meter across, half a meter tall, but could vary quite a bit. And then you plant your desert plants around the perimeter of these rock piles. And the rock serves as mulch. You know, we've all experienced some fierce desert monsoon storms in the summer, and I swear 2 hours after the sun pops out, in most places, the ground is just dry as dirt again. But not underneath these rock piles. Rainfall easily penetrates the rocks and soaks the ground underneath, and the rocks hold the moisture underneath for days. And so these folks ultimately concluded that this 1,200-acre rock mulch farm was used exclusively to grow agave. And they conservatively estimate 100,000 plants growing there at any one time, with an annual yield of possibly 10,000 plants and 30 metric tons of edible product. So growing agaves was a serious business indeed. Next up, we're going to look at the Sonaga. The Sonaga were north of the Hohokam, and their range extended from north of Flagstaff, then south through the breadth of the Verde Valley, including Red Rock Country and Sedona. In fact, the vast majority of the exquisite rock art panels and small to moderate-sized cliff dwellings that are found in the Sedona area are associated with the Sonaga. So the Sonaga seem to have been influenced by both the ancestral Puebloans to the north, who would have taught them some architectural styles and building methods, and possibly the Hohokam from the south, who seem to have taught them some farming techniques. And it's quite likely that the Sonaga traded regularly with both. So we have three different anthropogenic agave cultivars with which we associate the Sonaga, and two of these are endemic to the area. And then finally, we'll take a look at the Salado. The Salado set up camp in sort of the eastern part of what had been the range of the Hohokam. And they were there from roughly AD 1150 through 1450 and essentially represent a merger of Hohokam, who had been there previously, along with some Mugion-influenced ancestral Puebloans who had been migrating through the area. The center of Salado territory from an agave seed perspective would be the Roosevelt Lake area and Tonto Creek. But their range grew as time went on, and they spread into Sierra Ancha, the Safford Basin, the San Pedro watershed. They had a pretty extensive range. And across this range, there's a single agave cultivar found in large numbers, and that is Agave Materai. I've found more than 200 Agave Materai sites, most of which are in this area. That is more than all of the other cultivars combined, and it suggests that this area was once heavily populated. So why were these folks so interested in agaves? Well, agaves, since long before they developed these cultivars, provided a source of food and fiber and quite a few things to meet their needs. And let's take a closer look at that for the moment. First off, as a food item, agaves undergo a pretty dramatic change when they're about to bloom. Marginal spines wane, leaves narrow, and the plants begin to swell at the base where they're collecting sugars for subsequent use in their flowers. And that is when these folks would harvest these agaves for pit roasting. And not coincidentally, that is also when mezcal and tequila growers also harvest, because they want the agaves at their very sweetest. So the idea is you pull these agaves up out of the ground, and then you strip all the leaves off of them, and keep in mind they had to do this with some primitive stone tools. It was quite a job. And you wind up with something that looks for all the world like a giant pineapple. And this is called a cabeza. The cabeza is Spanish for head, and it's the name that we use to describe the part of the agave that gets pit roasted. And so they prepare these agaves, they toss them in a pit in which a fire is already burning, some sort of coal or rock fire. They throw as many of the cabezas in there as they want, and then cover the whole mess up and start another fire on top. 2 to 4 days later, the agaves are ready to harvest. And the taste of agave is often described as similar to sweet potatoes or molasses. I've tasted a couple of different agaves. I've tasted Agave Murphy Eye and Palmeri, and I can tell you they're very, very tasty. Kind of a bit of a woody flavor, not a real strong flavor. They're sweet, but they're not too sweet. I can't imagine anyone not liking them. It's a very, very pleasant flavor. And so the idea is you cut a hunk of this agave heart out and you plop it into your mouth and you chew on it, and all the nutritious substance just dissolves into your mouth. Unfortunately, you are then left with a wad of fiber in your mouth, and this has to be spit out. And these spit fibers have a name. They're called quids, and quids are considered an archaeological artifact that can provide some evidence about who was living where and what they were eating. It's very interesting. But the final analysis is that the reason you're never going to see agaves offered at any of our finer restaurants is this problem with the quids. Oh well. Next up, agaves have long been used as a source of beverage. When these agaves are ready to bloom, again, it starts swelling up, the base of the plant swells up and it's collecting these sugars. You can go another route. Instead of pulling the plant up out of the ground to pit roast, you can leave it in the ground and put a tap in there and use the tap to extract this fluid that it's collecting. And this fluid has a name. It's called aguamiel. And some of us are probably familiar with aguamiel from our trips to the grocery store, where it's become somewhat popular lately as agave nectar, agave sweetener. That's aguamiel. And so if you leave aguamiel out to ferment for a little while, you wind up with a white, viscous, beer-like drink. It's about 10% alcohol called pulque. And pulque has long been used by indigenous Native Americans, going back at least as far as the Aztecs, who used it in, heaven forbid, ritual human sacrifice and other very sacred religious ceremonies. It's been used for a long, long time, and there is some evidence that the indigenous Native Americans in the desert Southwest were also using pulque, probably to a lesser extent because our desert agaves are a little smaller than those from Mesoamerica, and they're not quite as full of fluid, and so they wouldn't be able to develop as much pulque. But I'm pretty sure that they were using it. And next up we have fiber. Agaves have long been used as a source of fiber to make clothing and sandals. You could snap the tip off of an agave leaf, the terminal spine, and you could carefully pull it down, and you'll probably get a whole wad of fiber that comes with it as long as you keep pulling. And the fibers can be pretty thick, and you could do with them what you want. You could trim it to whatever size you want. You can just leave it as is, or you can actually braid it, and you wind up with a ready-made needle and thread to do with as you wish. Next up, agaves can be used as building material. The terminal spines can be used as construction nails. Stalks can be used for window ledges and door ledges. The leaves, dried up leaves, can be used as roofing shingles. And the stalks also can be used as walking sticks and have long been used they've even used by modern day Apache to craft musical instruments, including flutes and stringed instruments. And then finally, agaves have long been used as a source of soap and medicine. Usually, primarily the root stock of these plants, they're very high in saponins, and saponins have some pretty serious antibiotic and fungicidal properties to help with the healing of deep wounds, and it can also be used as a soap and shampoo. So let's jump ahead to the modern day and see what the agave landscape is today. We have more than 200 agave species formally described. They have an epicenter in Mexico. Their range also extends into the Caribbean and Central America and the United States, where they are taking up residence in Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California, with the number of taxa in Arizona exceeding that of the other states combined. So agaves are plants of the mid to high desert. Most agaves, certainly not all, but most reside at elevations between 3,000 and 7,000 feet. Some quite a bit higher, some a little lower, but about 90%, let's say, live within that elevation range, and that's certainly true in Arizona as well. Agaves are monocarpic, which means that they bloom once and then die. There's an old wives' tale associated with agave's common name of century plant, that they live to be 100 years old before blooming and then perishing. Partially true, they do bloom and then perish, but most agaves do so after, let's say anywhere from 8 to about 40 years of age. Very few agaves would ever live to the ripe old age of 100. So we currently have 22 agave taxa in Arizona. Some of these are varieties and subspecies, and some are presumed anthropogenic cultivars, and that leaves us with 12 naturally occurring species. And of those 12 naturally occurring species, 3 are central players in our agave cultivar drama, and so let's take a close look at them. First up, we have Agave Chrysanthus. Chrysanthus is the most significant player in our cultivar drama. If you look at the range map, you'll see it occupies a pretty broad swath of central Arizona, and in fact, their range overlaps the range of our cultivars to the tune of about 90%. And so almost everywhere where we find these cultivars, we also find Chrysanthus, and usually a lot of Chrysanthus. It's not rare, it's not unusual, it's very common. You get to the right elevation, the right area in the mountains, and you'll find lots and lots of Agave Chrysanthus, and certainly so did our ancient indigenous Native Americans who developed these cultivars. And so you have to ask yourself, why? Why wouldn't they just harvest Chrysanthus and use them as a source of fiber and food? And the obvious answer to me seems to be that they didn't like it very much. It's not very sweet. The leaves are just miserably difficult to cut and trim if you wanted to pit roast some cabezas. And so it seems pretty obvious to me that for whatever reason, they did not like Agave Chrysanthus and instead chose to go another way. So the photo that we're looking at right now is from the northern part of Agave Chrysanthus range, where the plants tend to be a little smaller and bluer and maybe have a little bigger spines. Next up, this photo is from the southern end of Agave Chrysanthus range. The plants tend to be quite a bit larger, have longer, narrower leaves. This pair here is about 4 meters across. And then here is an interesting Agave Chrysanthus. This is, in fact, the only fully variegated agave I have ever found out in habitat. It's from the northern part of Chrysanthus range. It isn't particularly relevant to the story I am relaying today, but I just thought it might generate some oohs and ahs. Next up, we have Agave Palmeri. And if you look at the range map again, you'll see that Palmeri starts up kind of where Chrysanthus leaves off, occupying a pretty broad swath of southeastern Arizona. Its range also extends into New Mexico and well into Sonora, Mexico. Palmeri is the largest Arizona agave. On average, the plant shown there is probably about 6 feet tall and wide. And unlike Agave Chrysanthus, Agave Palmeri is actually quite popular with Native Americans. It's very sweet, it's very easy to pit roast. They seem quite fond of it. Here is another shot of Agave Palmeri. This plant on the right is about 7 feet across. And then here is a shot of Agave Palmeri blooms. And if you look at this photo, you'll notice something a little peculiar about it, and that is that the bloom stalk in the center looks quite different from all the rest. It has a reddish cast, and the others seem to be kind of a bright yellow. And that's just something that Palmeri does. All through its range, it has these 2 different bloom colors. It's unusual. As far as I know, Agave Palmeri is the only agave that demonstrates this type of bloom color dimorphism. It varies quite a bit from population to population. Often the population might be 90% yellow, 10% red. There's one particular population where it's just the other way around, where we have 90% red and 10% yellow. It varies quite a bit from area to area, and it's kind of unusual. There's no real explanation for it that makes any sense. I suspect that it might have something to do with indigenous Native Americans maybe moving these plants around and growing them here and there and winding up with this little bloom color dimorphism thing that we're still trying to sort out. But it's very interesting in one particular way, in that these bloom color schemes align really, really well, each of them with different cultivars, at least 2 of them for each color. And it's very interesting. And there's no doubt about it that Agave Palmeri is the most closely related, naturally occurring agave to our cultivars. We know that by virtue of flower morphology and more recently by DNA analysis. And so Palmeri seems to have a hand in the creation of these cultivars. And that would make a lot of sense if you wanted to build a better mousetrap. You create a little different plant that you would start out with an agave that you already are quite fond of. And next up, we have Agave Perieye. So Perieye is a very different agave than Palmeri and Chrysanthus. You know, those two, Palmeri and Chrysanthus, plus all the cultivars, are all kind of similar to each other in certain ways. You know, from a discrete distance, it would be pretty easy to mistake one species for another. Not so much with Perieye. Perieye is a very different cat. It's a smaller plant. It's very much more compact. The leaves are very, very stiff and rigid. And if you look at the range map, you'll notice that its range overlaps that of both Palmeri and Chrysanthus, but Perieye actually grows at higher elevation than either of those, and higher elevation than the cultivars are found at as well. And in fact, Perieye is Arizona's only montane agave. And so it doesn't really seem to have a whole lot to do with our cultivars, except for one thing. It appears that our ancient indigenous Native Americans who crafted these cultivars and farmed them were also quite fond of Agave Perieye. And I know that because I find Agave Perieye all across the state in areas where it does not occur naturally. And the most logical explanation is that they were moved there by the same folks who were growing these agave cultivars. And in fact, we find them sometimes growing alongside the likes of Agave materai and Agave Phillipsiana. So there's a lot of evidence to support that supposition. Here's another shot of Agave Perieye. This plant in the middle is the largest Agave Perieye I have ever seen. By the time it bloomed, it was 54 inches across and 48 inches tall. That is an absolute monster of an Agave Perieye. And then finally, here is an Agave Perieye bloom shot. Agave Perieye blooms are among the most beautiful of all agaves. There's really, really something to see in person. If you ever have an opportunity, don't pass it up. You will never forget it. But you might notice that the flower stalks look quite a bit different than the Palmeri blooms, and they also look quite a bit different from those of Chrysanthus. And so in some case, it seems that our ancient Native Americans decided to build a better mousetrap. And they tried to use techniques such as selection and possibly hybridization to craft an agave more suited to their varied needs. And these agaves that we find today, and there are 5 of them, have certain qualities in common. For one thing, they are all found exclusively near archaeological features. For another, they are all mid-sized, and they are all reproductively compromised, and that's really important. That's how they were discovered in the first place, or at least discovered to be distinct from naturally occurring agaves. Of the 5, 2 are sterile, don't create any seeds at all. 2 create a tiny little bit of seed up near the top of their stalks, no more than 5%, say, what a naturally occurring agave would produce. And then the 5th is a bulbal producers, and bulbils are little plantlets that grow along bloom stalks where naturally occurring agaves would be developing seed within their seed pods. So they're all reproductively compromised, and that kind of sets them apart from agaves that are occurring here naturally. Next, they all produce large, healthy cabezas, and they all have soft, pliable leaves. And that's a very important quality that in and of itself would have been well worth taking some time to select for, because I can tell you, You know, when I was discussing the process of pit roasting agaves, I described how these folks had to strip the leaves off, and they only had primitive stone tools to do it. And I can tell you, it is a miserable job. It can take a long, long time to try to strip the leaves off of a naturally occurring agave with a stone tool. And in addition to all the time and muscle required, there's all the blood loss and bruises and, oh. Well, our cultivars all have very soft, pliable leaves that these stone tools cut through like butter. So it could take a 45 or 50-minute job and turn it into about 10 minutes. And that is a huge savings in time and energy, especially if you're pit roasting a lot of agaves. So next up, these agaves are sweeter than naturally occurring agaves and thus better tasting. They also reproduce vegetatively, which they had better do since they're all reproductively compromised. They all produce a lot of pups. And that's why we still find them out there hundreds and hundreds of years after they were abandoned. You know, the agaves that we find out there today, at least these cultivars, are pups of pups of pups of pups going back hundreds of years. It's really miraculous that there are any there at all. And finally, they all have an unusually homologous morphology. You know, when we come across a hillside full of Agave Chrysanthus or Agave Palmeri, there's a lot of variation, one plant to another. Some are green, some are blue, some are big, some are small, some have big, gnarly marginal spines, and some have smaller spines that are more numerous. The bottom line is you could collect all the plants off of a hillside, pot them up, and put them in a nursery, and you would be hard-pressed to believe that they are all the same species. Not so with our cultivars. Our cultivars are all virtually identical, and that is not only true across individual populations, but the breadth of their range. And the reason for that is that they're all clones. They don't reproduce sexually. They just offset or they produce bulbils, and these are identical clones. So again, hundreds and hundreds of years, generation after generation, identical clones, almost no variety. And so when I'm out somewhere in habitat and I see an isolated little group of agaves that I don't recognize, and they all look identical and have soft, pliable leaves, my cultivar suspicion meter often starts ticking loudly. So let's take a look at our agaves. Excuse me. Let's start with Agave Murphy Eye. Agave Murphy Eye is also known as the Hohokam agave. Our little tale about the Agave rock mulch farm in Marana was Agave Murphy Eye, almost certainly grown there. There's no direct evidence, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and primarily it is that Agave Murphy Eye just tolerates heat and sun better than any naturally occurring agave in Arizona. And this rock mulch farm was found at fairly low elevation. And so that is certainly the most likely agave that would have been grown there that could tolerate this area. Other agaves would have just burned up. But Murphy Eye is our bulbul producer also that we were talking about just recently. And again, bulbils are little plantlets that grow along bloom stalks where seed pods normally develop. And you know, when we're considering these cultivars, it's important to consider the individual advantages of each. We know Native Americans have been using agaves for generations, many hundreds of years, as a natural resource. And so in order to make sense of this cultivar development, there must be some specific advantages provided by each. And with Agave Murphy Eye, there are two that really stick out. And one is bulbul development. I mean, what could be easier than just plucking 500 or so weather-toughened little plantlets off a bloom stalk to replace harvested plants or start a new farm plot somewhere? Much easier than growing from seed in far greater numbers than trying to collect offsets. So that's a terrific advantage. And another great advantage of Murphy Eye is its bloom time. You know, agaves in Arizona have a fairly brief window when they bloom, maybe about 4 months or so across the whole state, could be half of that in any one given area. And you can't just pull up an agave and pit roast it when you get a hankering for some agave flesh. You have to harvest them when they're ready, just like with any other money crop. And that is when they're about to bloom, and well, we've already gone into that. But Agave Murphy Eye blooms at a very, very different time. And so it provides a source of food when naturally occurring agaves do not. Here's another shot of Agave Murphy Eye. This is a healthy little patch going not too far from Lake Pleasant. I'm aware of 22 agave patches growing in the state of Arizona right now. There's not many left. Most are pretty paltry and have just a few plants in them. They're very high risk of in situ extinction. But this is kind of a happy little bunch, and most of the Murphy Eye that we find today are growing around the Lake Pleasant and New River areas. Some are at very low elevations, as low as 1,800 feet. And again, most other agaves in Arizona could never tolerate the sun and the heat at that elevation. But Murphy Eye, it's like water off a duck's back. So here's another Murphy Eye shot. This is an agave Murphy Eye currently flowering. You could see on the lower branches there are some bright yellow flowers there. And the bloom stalks of Murphy Eye are a little bit shorter than those of most naturally occurring agaves in Arizona, maybe about 12 to 15 feet, something like that. And if you come back to this very scene about 3 months later, this is what you'll find. Where naturally occurring agaves will have seed developing and seed pods, on Murphy Eye you find the bulbils, and there they are. And the idea of bulbal development is pretty interesting, and it's not a bad one. The idea is that they continue to grow on the stalk as it develops, as it's able to get maybe a little moisture from rainfall here and there, it shoots up the stalk. The bulbils continue to grow, the stalk gets heavier and more unwieldy, and then maybe one of our famous monsoon summer storms comes along and blows the stalk down. And any bulbils fortunate enough to make contact with soil can root and grow, because bulbils are very, very aggressive growers for at least the first couple or 3 weeks of their lives. It's a great scheme. It's not, all that terrific, but it's a lot more efficient than seed development, that's for sure. So next up, we have Agave materai. Agave materai is the agave that we associate with the Salado in the Tonto Basin, Roosevelt Lake area primarily. We found a lot of it there, at least 200 sites, which is more than all of the other agave cultivars combined. And that suggests that this area was once very heavily populated. So materai is a really pretty plant. It has an unusually ascending posture. It's about, maybe 3.5, 4 feet tall and wide, beautiful blue-green leaves, banded. And if you wonder what the advantage of Agave materai is, the main advantage is that it is sweeter and thus better tasting than naturally occurring agaves. And Agave materai is completely sterile. And so every one that we find out there is an offset of an offset of an offset, again, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. It's really just miraculous. And here's another example of Agave materai with a sharply ascending posture. Most agaves have these beautiful rosettes, and the leaves spread out. Not so much with materai. Materai leaves tend to grow very upright, and it gives the plants a very different look from those of Chrysanthus in these areas where it grows. And so it's an easy way to tell them apart. And here's another shot of Agave materai. This bunch is growing northeast of Globe. And here's a bloom shot of Agave materai. And if you think back to that photo that I showed of Agave Palmeri flowers, that one in the middle, that reddish one, almost identical to the blooms of Agave materai. Not identical, but almost a little teeny tiny bit different, and the size is the same, and they tend to align very, very well. And if you look at the third branch up from the bottom, you'll see one of Agave materai favorite pollinators having a little rest on the stalk. And hummingbirds may not do Agave materai a whole lot of good since they're sterile, but I can tell you they really, really enjoy agave nectar. It's just one of their very favorites out there. Next up, we have Agave Phillipsiana. So Phillipsiana is kind of like Della Materai, in it's about the same size, 3.5, 4 feet tall and wide. It is also completely sterile, like Agave Della Materai. The leaves are a little longer and narrower, and they're definitely greener. I really, really like Phillipsiana. It's just my personal opinion. It's my favorite of the bunch, the plant that I think is the most beautiful to see out in habitat. And Phillipsiana has its own advantages, just like Della Materai and Murphy Eye did. And for one thing, it is sweeter than naturally occurring agaves. Big important advantage, and that's true of pretty much all of the cultivars. And it has another advantage, not unlike Agave Murphy Eye. It has a different bloom time. Its bloom time is not dramatically different, with which it is with Murphy Eye, but Phillipsiana tends to bloom about maybe 2 weeks or so later than any naturally occurring agaves in the area. And so it extends the harvest time and again provides a source of food at a time when naturally occurring agaves do not. So here's another shot of Agave Phillipsiana, happy, healthy little bunch. This bunch is growing just southwest of Prescott. And Phillipsiana is one of the agaves that we associate with the Sonaga, although it has a very, very broad range, just as broad as Della Materai, but there aren't nearly as many of them around. And Phillipsiana has another thing going for it that makes it different from all the rest of them, just a little oddity about it. It's also found in the Grand Canyon of all places. So that suggests that, number one, it's very hardy. It's hardier than the other agave cultivars, which it is. But it also suggests that it may have some association with some indigenous Native Americans that were living up there long ago. Perhaps the ancestral Puebloans. Hard to say. Perhaps some southern Paiutes who moved in after the ancestral Puebloans abandoned the area. We really don't know. And it doesn't help in any way, shape, or form with trying to figure out where Phillipsiana originally came from or who crafted it. In fact, it just kind of adds an additional layer of obfuscation, but I find it pretty interesting. And here's another shot of Phillipsiana. You can see it's just an absolutely beautiful agave. And here is a bloom shot. And it's very similar. The flowers are very similar to those of Della Materai. You can see it also has a bit of a reddish cast, not as dramatic as those of Della Materai. And again, like Della Materai, Phillipsiana is completely sterile, and these pods just drop off almost immediately as soon as they're done flowering. And Phillipsiana also appears to be the most closely related of the 5 to Palmeri, that via DNA analysis. Next up, we have Agave verdensis. Agave verdensis is endemic to the Verde Valley and associated with the Sonaga. It's about half the size of Agave Della Materai and Phillipsiana. It's a beautiful blue-green agave. It has some banding. Looks very much like a half-grown Della Materai, with which it is easily confused. What advantages are bestowed by verdensis? Very, very sweet. In fact, quite possibly the sweetest of all the agaves. There's a little area just a little south of where I found this patch that's shown on the screen right now. And I go in there every year, and it's a really interesting little spot where there's verdensis and verdensis-like agaves growing with some other agaves that are Agave Chrysanthus-like and appear to be naturally occurring. And every year, I go in there and try to get some blooms to try to analyze these plants and see what's going on. Well, it turns out this area has some cattle grazing in it. And every year I go in, and it's the same old story. The cattle have torn down all the verdensis and verdensis-like bloom stalks, and they leave the chrysanthus and chrysanthus-like stalks alone. Why? Because the verdensis stalks are sweeter. And in this case, it seems to spoil them, and then they're not so interested in the chrysanthus stalks after they're done polishing off all of the verdensis stalks. Oh well, maybe next year. So here's another shot of Agave verdensis, and you can see the plant on the left has a green stalk coming up coming up from the base, and that suggests that this plant has either just bloomed or is about to bloom. And here's another shot of Agave verdensis, and if you look closely at the center of this plant, you'll see some shenanigans going on here. And that is an emerging bloom stalk just starting to come up. And so this is exactly when you would want to harvest this plant for pit roasting. This is the time when it's ripe. This is when it's at its sweetest. And here is a flower shot of Agave verdensis. And you might notice that it's very different looking from the flowers of Agave Phillipsiana and materai. And in fact, it looks quite a bit like the yellow blooms on Agave Palmeri and the yellow Palmeri blooms. And these flowers are just a little bit smaller than Palmeri blooms, but other than that, they line up extremely well. Next up, we have Agave Yavapansis. Yavapansis is also exclusively growing in the Verde Valley. It sometimes grows alongside verdensis. They're in the same area. They're both associated with the Sonaga. They were described in the same paper at the same time by Wendy Hodgson and Andrew Salomon in 2013. And in fact, the epicenter of each is separated by only about 8 miles. And Yavapansis looks a lot like verdensis. They're about the same size, leaves just a little bit longer and narrower. They're about the same color. Really beautiful agave, just like verdensis. The big advantage is they are sweeter. They tend to bloom about the same time as verdensis, maybe just a week or so later, but very, very close. Their bloom overlap is significant. And here's another shot of Yavapansis. This is a half-grown plant, and at this size, they greatly resemble Agave verdensis. And here's another shot of verdensis. This is a happy, healthy little bunch. It's the only patch of Agave Yavapansis that I've ever found east of I-17. And it's just kind of interesting. They're not too far from Montezuma as well. And Yavapansis and verdensis, they're kind of the Bobbsey twins of this bunch. They have a lot in common. And another thing they have in common, other than what I've already talked about, is that these are the two cultivars that actually produce some paltry amount of seed. It's not very much, but the seed is absolutely viable. It doesn't seem to be doing them any good at all where they're growing. All their reproduction seems to be clonal, as the area appears to be too harsh for seed germination and seedling development. But they do produce seed, and if it's collected, it can be grown elsewhere. Next up, these are the bloom stalks of Yavapansis. So the flowers are very, very similar to the flowers of verdensis. They're just almost identical, but the stalks are actually quite a bit different. And you can tell if you're looking at verdensis stalks or Yavapansis stalks from quite a distance if you see them out in habitat and you get to know what each one looks like. So with Yavapansis stalks, they have shorter branches. There are more branches. They're more robust. There are more flowers. Just a really different looking stalk. And again, like verdensis, they do produce a paltry little amount of seed just toward the top of the stalk. So that is it for our 5 cultivars. Now, let's take a look at their fate. And I'm sorry to say it is not a pretty story. These agaves were abandoned by their caretakers hundreds of years ago. They were never intended to grow and survive on their own. And ever since they were left behind, they have been slowly spiraling toward inevitable in situ extinction. There are many causes for this. The main cause, in my opinion, is climate change. And I don't necessarily mean anthropogenic climate change, although that certainly exacerbates the issue, but just normal climate cycles that we go through. You know, we could go through these cycles that may last a year or two, or a decade or two, or maybe even longer. Right now, we seem to be in the midst of a prolonged drought in central Arizona that's gone on for maybe about 30 years. And these agave cultivars have not done real well in this period. Naturally occurring agaves can adapt to these things just like all plants do. You know, their range can wax and wane as natural conditions allow. Also, they develop seed, and so they can repopulate these areas. You know, once conditions become more amenable and maybe they've driven out, well, they can always come back in. And another reason that the cultivars are having such a hard time with climate is the fact that they are all clones. There's this genetic diversity deficit in these plants. You know, if you pull a seed pod off of an agave, any kind of agave, but let's say Palmeri, some of these seeds will develop into plants that are more suited for hotter, drier conditions. Some are more suited for cooler, wetter conditions. A variety of different little things. They're not all the same. You know, they're the product of sexual reproduction, just like we are, and there's little differences in them. There's no way to tell what's what until the seedlings development, but in general, the seedlings that do develop and survive are those that are best suited for the area, you know, when they develop, and this is what they find. But there's no opportunity for our cultivars to do that because there is this genetic diversity deficit that was brought on by the fact that these plants are severely reproductively compromised, and that's no accident. You know, when our Native Americans developed these plants and they finally wound up with what they wanted, they did their best to make these plants sterile. I don't know how to do it. It's a terrific mystery. It's not a genetic thing. It's not a ploidy issue. I have no idea why these agaves are so severely reproductively compromised, but they are, and there's very little doubt that it was done on purpose because the folks who made them wanted to lock these qualities in, because if they allowed them to reproduce sexually, they would just revert to their former selves. And the fact that they can't do that is why they are so vulnerable to our changing climate. On a not unrelated subject, we have wildland fires. You know, in a 10-year period from 2004 to 2013, we had some 30,000 wildland fires across Arizona that burned some 3 million acres across the state. Just staggering. And there's no way for our agave cultivars to survive the worst of these fires since they don't produce seed. They get burned out. They have no way to come back. Once they're gone, they're gone. Then we have building and development. You know, all agaves are considered protected native plants in Arizona, which means that you can't harvest them. It's illegal to take a single offset without a permit. Now, these permits are not that difficult for builders to acquire. And that is the problem. Agave Yavapansis in particular is at super risk for becoming extinct, possibly sometime within our lifetime because of building and development. Most Yavapansis are grown in these two little parcels of land in the Verde Valley, and they both look pretty ripe for development to me. It's very unfortunate. The thing that could protect these plants would be designation as endangered species. Unfortunately, our cultivars are considered exempt from endangered species status because they are considered anthropogenic cultivars. That may sound a little harsh, but there's actually a pretty good reason for it. Most anthropogenic cultivars are money crops, farm crops, modern-day farm crops. And so the idea is that if someone designs a better radish, you don't want a radish that was grown 10 years ago that may have escaped out into the wild somewhere to wind up being designated an endangered species at some point. That's the idea. I would really love it if our agaves were given some special consideration since they were found, they were here before Europeans ever stepped foot in the Americas, and I would hope that would give them some special consideration, but apparently it does not. My only suggestion would be to call your local congressman, and good luck trying to find someone who gives a damn. Oh well. Another problem these agaves have is agave mite. Agave mite is a particularly nasty pathogen that has been spreading pretty wildly across the desert southwest. You know, most pathogens tend to take advantage of weakened plants, plants that are not at their best. And I mentioned a little bit ago that we seem to be in a long, prolonged drought right now in Arizona and the desert southwest in particular. And that drought has been good news for agave mite. We find agave mite in habitat all across Arizona. It is also in just about every botanic garden and nursery in the southwest. It's very, very hard to get rid of. It's very contagious. It is a problem. It scars agaves that are afflicted with it. It can kill agaves. And unfortunately, it presents another problem that is unique to our cultivars. Well, uniquely bad for our cultivars, I should say. It seems that agaves that have a pretty good agave mite infection going are incapable of pupping. They can't produce offsets. And since that is the primary way by which our cultivars propagate, it seems to be adding substantially to their extinction risk. It's a real problem. And agave mite has set up shop in the Verde Valley. We have found Agave Phillipsiana, verdensis, Yavapansis with agave mite. In fact, agave mite polished off an Agave verdensis site just last year. And again, you know, once they're gone, there is no way back. Very unfortunate. So let's end our little talk with what good news that we are able. If their inevitable extinction cannot be avoided but possibly prolonged, their ex situ survival can be assured. Possibly. So Agave Murphy Eye is a very popular landscape plant in the Phoenix area. For example, we find it in people's yards and shopping malls and street medians. It is everywhere. It's not a very well-known agave outside of the Phoenix area, but in Phoenix, it's everywhere. And so its survival is pretty much assured, at least within that context. Next up, we have Agave verdensis and Yavapansis. Now, these two do produce some paltry amount of seed. And that seed can be collected and distributed to interested parties around the globe, thus assuring its survival. Next up, Agave materai and Agave Phillipsiana. Well, they are sterile, and so they are at higher risk. But in conditions that are to their liking, they offset prodigiously. And so again, by just taking a modicum of care and concern, we can assure that these agaves survive, hopefully someday, so that we can enjoy them in our own gardens and botanic gardens everywhere. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my talk. If you're interested in the subject, the book Chasing Centuries is available. You can get it from your favorite retailer, or you can order directly from me if you would like to get a signed copy. In any case, I thank you for viewing my little talk, and I wish you a good night.